Hi, everyone, and welcome to another one of my YouTube videos on my blog, gaudiumetspes22.com. I haven't had a video interview in a while because of holidays and other writing projects. And a lot of the people that I interview are academics, and this is a really busy time of year for them as it's coming down towards the end of the semester. So it's sometimes harder to line up guests. But I'm very, very happy today. A much postponed interview with Dr. Roland Millare, who has written a wonderful book called A Living Sacrifice, Liturgy and Eschatology in Joseph Ratzinger. I have read about two-thirds of this book. I just admitted to him I haven't read the whole thing, about two-thirds of it, and it's magnificent. And one of the reasons why I wanted to interview him isn't just because it's a great book, but I'm also very interested in Ratzinger research these days and trying to foreground people that are into Ratzinger research. I am also good friends with Father Harrison Eyre, who runs the Clerically Speaking podcast, and he's doing a doctorate on Ratzinger's thought as well. And so I all of a sudden I just know all these people that are writing on Ratzinger, and so that's great because he needs to be written on. Dr. Millare serves. I'm going to just read this now. Serves as the vice president for curriculum and the program director of Shepherd's Heart, which is a continuing education and formation program for priests and deacons for the St. John Paul II Foundation in Houston, Texas. He is an adjunct professor of theology for deacon candidates at the University of St. Thomas School of Theology at St. Mary's Seminary in Houston, where the ordinariate sends its seminarians. Dr. Millare earned his doctorate in sacred theology at the Liturgical Institute, University of St. Mary of the Lake in Mundelein, Illinois. I know Mundelein well. I went to a conference a couple times there when Bishop Robert Barron was still the rector. Beautiful, beautiful place, right? So that's the bare bones sort of professional description of who you are, Roland. And maybe you could, though, fill in the blanks a little bit. Sometimes some viewers don't like all this introductory stuff, but others find it fascinating to know a little bit about the background. So you are of Filipino origin, but are you a native Filipino, or are you a native born American?
Yeah, so I make the joke that I'm a Texapino. So my parents are both from the Philippines, actually the same town, but they did not meet until they came over to the United States. My sister and I were born here in the U.S. So Texapino, it means I think George Strait's the king of country. I wear boots and I eat spam for breakfast. And that sort of thing. And so and I
Spam.
struggle with time man and I struggle with time management. Yeah, just thinly sliced with a little garlic fried rice, Larry.
Yeah, man, I
Have to
hate
try one of these
spam.
days.
I really hate spam. So that's funny as hell. I gotta say. So were you born in Houston?
I was born in Houston, native Houstonian, a product of Catholic education. I went to Catholic grade school, St. Francis Sales, high school, St. Thomas, and then for my undergraduate, I went to Steubenville, Franciscan University.
Oh, there you go. You grew up in Houston. That explains why you don't have that Fort Worth drawl going. So yeah, uh,
Exactly. Yep.
yeah. The sort of Billy Bob's honky tonk drawl of the Fort Worth, Texas, West Texas, and Central Texas. But anyway, enough of that. I love Texas. Been there many times. Great state. A little too hot for my blood in the summertime, but
And
nevertheless.
with Houston, it's humid as well, so there's that added.
No, I don't like winter. I hate winter. Winter is invented by Satan. But I also don't like Gulf of Mexico summers. It's a little too humid for my blood. But anyway, let enough of that. Now everybody knows who you are. Hopefully, everybody knows what a loser I am and who I am. And so onto your book here, which has quite a few. I want to point out to the viewers so that they can run out immediately and buy this book. I mean, there are some hefty endorsements on the back here. Tracy Rowland, who won the Ratzinger Prize, a famous theologian, obviously, in her own right, from Australia. Then you've got Father Aidan Nichols, the Dominican, who seems to write a book every 5 minutes. Uh, how many books has he written? 80 or something? That's just
Something
crazy,
like that.
Father Nichols. And then the Most Reverend Stephen J. Lopes, who is the Bishop of the Ordinary to the Chair of St. Peter. Anglican ordinariates, and Father Emery Degal, the University of St. Lake Mandalay Seminary. So there's some great endorsements there. So obviously we have about an hour or so. We're only going to be able to scratch the surface of the profound theology of Joseph Ratzinger. So let's get right into it. If you wanted to, in a sense, in a bullet line, the sort of main thesis of the book, and then we can branch out from there. What would you say then for our viewers? What is the main thesis of your book?
Sure. I would say the main thesis is Ratzinger's assertion that the logos has a primacy over ethos. And this comes up in several places in his theology, and he's getting it from Romano Guardini, who brings it up in his Spirit of the Liturgy. So the original version of the Spirit of the Liturgy, and it seems fitting, right? We just had a great loss of the American theologian David Schindler. So if you indulge me here a little bit, I'll read this from Schindler to kind of help tease out this relationship between.
Please do. I mean, I was dear friends with David Schindler. I'm going to his funeral on Friday, December 2nd. So please go ahead.
So this comes from David about the modern. He's describing the modern logos here. Sexual relations hollowed out into their material shell become lustful manipulation. Political relations hollowed out into their material shell become brutal power. Market relations hollowed out into their material shell become hedonistic consumerism. And music and architecture governed by the laws of such market relations become noise and harsh ugliness. Every ethos always needs a logos that precedes it and gives it meaning. And so, throughout my work, it's focused on this.
Can I stop you right there?
Sure.
Could you tell me the source of that David Schindler quote? Because I'm currently working on a blog post on David Schindler, and so I would love to include that quote. So where is that quote?
So I originally encountered it in the writing of Tracy Rowland. I want to say in her work on Thomism. I can't think of it now. It's culture
after Vatican. Culture, Thomism. Yeah. Okay.
Vatican II. But I want to say the source of the Schindler quote. It's in a series of essays put out by our Sunday Visitor. I want to say, I think it's Catholicism and Secularization in America.
I have that book. Okay, great.
Okay. Yeah.
If you could find it and eventually email it to me, I would appreciate that. But anyway,
I'll email that over to.
Go ahead.
So, I mean, the thesis is just there is logos, right? Which it's a Greek word for word, right? Word, reason, meaning. Ethos, we could just, for our purposes, describe as ethic. And so I am contrasting, in the theology of Ratzinger, right, this sacramental or Christian logos. So it's the idea that our logos were made for communion, and if that's the logos we're made for, then the ethos that follows from that is self-giving love. By contrast, and this is what David Schindler is describing when he's describing this material logos or ontology, the logos of our modern culture is all about autonomous individualism. And if that's the case, then the ethos that proceeds from that is utilitarianism, right? I mean, this is the personalistic thesis that you see in the writings of Otiwa, for example, right? The opposite of love is use. And so what I'm arguing in Ratzinger's theology of liturgy, is he is presenting this authentic sacramental logos that we are made for communion, and the corresponding ethos is charity, is self-giving love. Either we live for those words of Christ, this is my body given up for you, or if you think about our present culture, especially in the post-Dobbs world we live in, right? It simply says, This is my body, punto, right? There is no language of self-giving love, self-gift. And to get there, right, we need to establish this intrinsic relationship between the liturgy and eschatology. And so what I'm trying to do is try to show that eschatology isn't as far removed from our day-to-day experience. In fact, I think you had an article, I want to say it was in the Register, about us living kind of becoming an ad orientem church. Because there's ad orientem in more than one sense, right? Ad orientem literally, I mean, in terms of the the actual orientation of the celebrant during the sacred liturgy, but also in terms of just our disposition of living that moral life oriented towards Christ. Because the tension we find is people want to be all about liturgy and reverent liturgy and piety and acts of devotion, or they want to be all about social justice or social doctrine, and never the two shall meet, which is
Right,
obviously
right.
foreign to the tradition. And Ratzinger really does this beautiful job of uniting the two. I mean, he has that startling claim in his first encyclical Deus Caritas S, number 14, that a Eucharist which does not pass over into a concrete expression of love for neighbor or for another is intrinsically fragmented. And when you really think of it, it's kind of a startling phrase. I mean, he's suggesting that the mass, the liturgy, only finds its completion, when it's concretized in those works of charity. But it makes perfect sense in light of just the basic twofold command, right? Love God and love neighbor. And then so throughout the work, I'm trying to establish the primacy of the logos, then looking at the notion of sacrifice and how that fits into his theology of liturgy, then looking at this in terms of his Eucharistic ecclesiology, and then the implications for the celebration of liturgy in terms of beauty, and then also there's a chapter on charity and its relationship to the logos. The Ratzinger is referred to as the Mozart of theology, and so I'm trying to pick up on that aspect of the symphony, right? This relationship between liturgy and
Yeah.
eschatology, which has implications for the unity between logos, ethos. So
Yeah, very good. I mean, I like that. He's the Mozart of theology because everything as you've just described it right there. I mean, it's like a musical score, but it's all brought together beautifully into this organic, complete whole by Ratzinger's Christocentrism, which is that logos of which you spoke. And Ratzinger
yeah,
Pope Benedict spoke often of the importance of this. I mean, this is my thing. This is my blog, Gaudium et Spes 22. Only in the light of the Word made flesh does man make sense to himself. All right, I'm paraphrasing, obviously, and I mean, and this is the heart and soul of the Council. It's the heart and soul of Ressourcement Theologie. It is the heart and soul of Ratzinger's about. So maybe you could comment then at great length or at short length on Ratzinger's Christocentrism.
Yeah, so I'll pick up with Gaudium et Spes 22, right? So Gaudium et Spes 22, as you rightly say, Larry, I mean, is the logos, right? I mean, Christ fully reveals, the human person to himself or herself.
Yeah.
And then really you could take Gaudium et Spes 24 as the corresponding ethos, right? We only discover ourselves through a sincere gift of self, right? So even there in Gaudium et Spes, you have that tension between logos and ethos. And
Right.
as you know, right, I mean, of all the varying documents of Vatican II, the one that's most critiqued by Ratzinger is Gaudium et Spes, right? I mean, he's concerned about kind of this Pelagian element. There's too much of a emphasis on the hope in man, right? Kind of our that Pelagianism in terms of picking ourselves up by our own bootstraps, as opposed
Yeah.
to relying upon God. And so hence, and Wojtyła does as well, and so do many other Ressourcement theologians, right, focus in on Christocentrism, right? I mean, this, as you done repeatedly in your interviews and your writing, I have emphasized that this is really the heart of the council, right? I mean, it's this Christocentric aspect. And once we understand that, then everything else about the council falls into place, right? I mean, Dei Verbum is first and foremost about the revelation, not of the sources of revelation, but of Christ himself, the logos, right? I mean,
Yeah.
Christ is really the true lumen gentium, which the church is meant to reflect. And then the liturgy, right, Sacrosanctum Concilium, finds its source and summit in the Eucharistic logos, and then Gaudium et Spes is really the ethos that's supposed to follow from that logos, right? So that's another way of getting at it, looking at those first
Right.
three dogmatic constitutions as presenting the logos, Gaudium et Spes as the ethos, and repeatedly in his writings, Joseph Ratzinger highlights the third Constantinople. He highlights the writings of Saint Maximus the Confessor, In
Yeah.
particular, his concern is that we don't place enough emphasis upon the union of the two natures of Christ, and we have lost our focus on that centrality of Christ, or even just simply kind of the theocentrism, right? God has been eclipsed, right? I mean, that's another theme that comes up,
Yeah.
you know,
Well, let's
again
stop
and
there for a
again.
second. I mean, there's obviously perennially, I think it's even true now today, this constant temptation to fall back into a kind of quasi-Nestorianism, where when we're talking about Christ as divine, we focus in on the God bits, and then we're talking about Christ the human, we focus in on the human bits. But we tend to forget what that debate was all about. We tend to forget the Cyrillian solution. I mean, in my theologian that I spent my time, Hans Urs von Balthasar, is accused of having a hyper Cyrillian Christology. But the reason for that is because he so wants to emphasize, and I think Ratzinger does too, the union of those natures. And at the Council of Ephesus, the communication of idiom, communicatio idiomata, that comes out of that council, saying what you can say of the divinity, you can say of the humanity, and vice versa. That you can't split and rupture Christ in this way. Now, that has profound, then, theological consequences for our understanding of what it is that Revelation itself is proposing to us. We're not nearly appreciative enough of how provocative the Christian claim is, that God is revealing himself precisely, and therefore revealing us to ourselves precisely in and through Jesus of Nazareth, his life, death, and resurrection. And that is a claim that I think one of the things that the council was trying to do was to refocus the church on that claim Christocentrically. And now that's not a question, it's more of a comment, but maybe you want to follow up on that.
Yeah, and it's the liturgy that makes that life of Christ accessible to us, right? I mean, this is a theme
Yes.
in, the life of Virgil Michael, the Benedictine Virgin Michael, who was influential, as you know, on the servant of God, Dorothy Day, right? Or, and you see it in the writings of Columba Marmion, that Christ's life has to become our life. And it does that through the liturgy. That's why now we're in the season of Advent, and we go through the cycle again and again, that period of preparation, and then that period of the birth of Christ, and then period of penance and sorrow in Lent, in anticipation of the joy and glory of Easter. And much
Yeah.
of the cycle is ordinary, but that's true of life, right? There are moments of joy, there are moments of sorrow, and one of the great causes of secularization is people separate the sacramental and the liturgical from the everyday, and then they treat the Eucharist as a vitamin, when what we're really called to do is to integrate the two. And when you understand that union of the two natures of Christ, I mean, we see that we're called not to live in that same kind of schizophrenia that we want to. But you see that unfold. I mean, with respect to the liturgy, sometimes there's an emphasis too much on kind of the human nature, if you want, or the human aspects. And liturgy literally becomes the work of the people, in the sense that people manipulate it to how they want. So then I can, make the liturgy relevant. I mean, once I subordinate ethos to logos, then why can't I do what I want with the liturgy, as long as it's relevant in terms of music, or whether it's, as we saw a couple months ago, this pre-celebrating liturgy out in a raft, in the middle of the water, right? I mean,
Yeah.
well, why not? Or
Yeah.
the other extreme is that it's so divine and transcendent that it has absolutely no relationship, with the rest of the world, right? When it's
With an
with
exaggerate
Ratzinger.
with an exaggerated and rather static sense of the real presence of Christ, as something not dynamic, but it's just contained in that bread up in that tabernacle, and that's that. And that's why the priest should
Yeah,
face. That's why the priest should face away from the people, because he's got to face God, and that's not exactly why priests face away from the people.
yeah,
Don't send me emails. I'm not criticizing having the Eucharist in the tabernacle or the real presence, but this static concept of it, that it's not intrinsically related to the initial incarnation of the Word in the humanity of Christ, in the incarnation of the Word in Scripture, and then in the incarnation of the Word in the Eucharist, which is then oriented towards, in a sense, bringing that Eucharistic Christ into the world as transformed selves.
Yeah, and in fact, right, that's really at the heart of the tradition of ad orientem, right? We are all,
Yeah.
the priest is modeling for us, leading us to orient ourselves literally back towards Christ, the true Orions, so that then we can properly love our neighbor, right? That's the point of the liturgy. I mean, the words of St. Augustine, right? I mean, become like that which you have received. Or, St. John Chrysostom, right? I mean, you honor and revere Christ here on the altar, but yet you neglect Christ whom you encounter in the streets, right? There's not supposed to be this
Right.
separation, right? And this is really the beauty, I mean, the beautiful implication of what seems to many as esoteric, theological discussion. Really, it's very practical, right?
It
In a
is,
very real sense.
because you're absolutely right. I mean, you have to get the priority of logos over ethos right, as Ratzinger pointed out, but you also can't exaggerate one over the other. So, I mean, you can have an exaggerated sense of the logos of the Eucharist without therefore appreciating its ethos, which, as you pointed out, is self-giving love, kenotic, descending, self-giving, self-diffusive love. That's what the Eucharist is implanting within us and asking us to do ourselves. And this was Ratzinger's entire point, in the spirit of the liturgy. Not his entire point, but one of his central points in the spirit of the liturgy.
Yeah, and we see, how this also affects eschatology, right? When logos is subordinated to ethos, you get a version of eschatology that's only focused on the goods of this world, or if it might
Yeah.
even use liturgy for some sort of political end. And this is where some liberation theologies go wrong, whereas really, if you get the relationship between logos and ethos right, I mean, in terms of the priority of the sacramental logos, you can have an authentic theology of liberation. I mean, that's what's really at the heart of
Yeah.
the spirit of the liturgy, right? Where he's talking about the Exodus, right? We are all made. I mean, the purpose of the Exodus isn't just freedom from slavery to the Egyptians. It's being made for the freedom to worship God, ultimately in spirit and truth, right? Without being hindered by. And that's the authentic theology of liberation, which then has implications for how we love our neighbor here and now. But unfortunately, right? I mean, as you know, I mean, some of the liberation theologies, they focus only on the horizontal plane. They've lost sense of the vertical, and that this has implications.
And they lost the vertical because they replaced the logos of Christ with the logos of Marxist social analysis in many cases. Not all. Some. Obviously, liberation theology is a huge category. Some are better than others. I kind of like Gutierrez myself, Sobrino not so much. But yeah, I mean, there's that sense that I think when Ratzinger, to bring it back to Ratzinger, when Ratzinger was head of the CDF and criticized liberation theology, it was sort of precisely on these grounds: is yeah, liberation, that's great, but you guys are missing the boat here of where the true liberation actually resides, and why the gospel message really is fundamentally, completely a message of liberation to bondage, to sin, and so on. But that requires getting the logos right. That requires that Christocentric vision. And all too often, the liberation theology spun off in directions that did not keep that sort of logos of Christ front and center.
And it doesn't help. I mean, just in the discipline of theology in general, right? There's been this loss of the sense of the unity of the whole. Everybody has their kind of niche, aspect of theology that they focus in on, and then there's no dialogue, right? And then so you have ethics developing apart from sacramental theology, and vice versa. But that doesn't serve the church at all, I think. But
No,
I mean,
that's true.
The beauty of the Ratzinger's symphony is its, and this was one of the challenges of writing on Ratzinger. You can't just write on liturgy. You have to write on Christology, you have to write on ecclesiology,
Oh,
you have to write on ethics. You have to engage all of it because he's a full theologian, right? In the
don't
original
I know?
sense.
I mean, I had the same problem in writing my dissertation on von Balthasar, because I mean, it's a kaleidoscopic sort of thing, and you have to get all the colors right and the form right, and one bit's connected to the other bit, and yeah, so unraveling one means unraveling all of it, and then you end up in deep kimchi, because you're just knee deep in all kinds of stuff, and at some point you have to limit yourself. But
Yeah,
anyway,
it's
go
so for
ahead.
me that the focus was, with the approach was to look at the implications of Christology, the Christocentrism, that Cyrillian theology for Ratzinger, and then this proper relationship between liturgy, between logos and ethos, liturgy and eschatology, um, and this is why Ratzinger goes on to say that Romans 12:1 is kind of the one of the essential verses for understanding liturgy. It's where St. Paul says, "I urge you, brethren, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship." I mean, that latter phrase, spiritual worship, right, is the logiken latreia, right, or logike
But yeah,
patria. And what St. Paul's
yeah.
getting at there is that he's not talking about the liturgy of the Mass. He's talking about our lives. So there's got to be this intrinsic relationship between the liturgy and then how we live, because otherwise people have no uh, access point or encounter with the liturgy, right? Most people aren't going to liturgy. We know the terrible numbers of the decreasing number of nuns and secularization and so forth. So the key then is Christians, encountering Christ in the sacred liturgy, and then in turn they encounter, that charity lived out in the midst of the
And then
liturgy.
that has a rebound effect, and which then keeps, and both sides keep feeding each other, the logos and the ethos, because once you feel energized, and first, I mean, it's a sort of a chicken and the egg question sometimes too. I mean, I'm not saying logos doesn't have priority, that it does, but it does. But one isn't going to really be able to see the truth of the logos unless one is already cracked open your heart to love. And understand why that's so important. So you bring that whole need, that thirst, that package to the Eucharist. Then you appreciate it more. The Eucharist feeds you, and that then makes you double down on the sort of gift reception motif and our relationship with God, and the need to give all that away. And then the more you live that in a sanctified way, the more you appreciate the logos of the Eucharist all over again. And it just, the two feed each other, and it gets deeper and deeper and deeper and more profound. So I find as I get older, even at so-called lousy liturgies, with crap music and bad homilies and perfunctory rubrics and so on, not even abused rubrics, just perfunctory, that I'm getting so psyched up about it, because my own life, as I get old at 64 and stuff, it's just, I just now see these things so much more clearly than I did when I was 24. But anyway, back to you.
Um, uh, you know, I mean, I know in my own experience, right? I mean, I was involved in Life Teen and some of the praise and worship and the
Yeah.
charismatic piece. I mean, I graduated from Franciscan University of Steubenville, but now I've kind of gone in a different direction. I mean, the liturgy of the ordinariate, divine worship, colon the missal, or just simply reverent celebration of the missal according to St. Paul VI, St. John Paul II, or even the old missal. I mean, all three of those,
Well, that's kind of my
approaches.
point. Yeah, that's kind of my point, which is that there is such a thing as good liturgy and bad liturgy. Don't get me wrong. And there are elements of the old Latin Mass that I think we lost, that I think is deeply regrettable. On the other hand, I like Mass in the vernacular. And I like Mass, the prayers being said out loud with responses from the community. And so on. I attend the Anglican Ordinariate liturgy, which is quite beautiful. I think that if we had gotten a Reformed liturgy in that regard, we'd have been in much better shape And so I do have my criticisms of the Novus Ordo, but nevertheless, my point is that whether it's the Novus Ordo or the ordinary traditional Latin Mass or some of the other rites in the church, um, if it's done with reverence, if it's done with manifest faith, with I mean, in a sense, a lot of liturgical miscues can be covered up by charity, by deep and profound faith, by deep and profound holiness. I've been to some liturgies where the priest was just a kind of bumbling liturgical nightmare, not intentionally, just because he was a liturgical troglodyte and just didn't get it, didn't understand, and yet the liturgy was magnificent and beautiful in its own way, because the priest was just so wonderful and humble, and the community itself was wonderful and humble. And I've said this over and over and over again, and I don't think Ratzinger would disagree with this, that if your faith is properly centered on the logos that is Christ, and that logos is what animates your parish, the ethos that then flows from that, okay, it is going to be that self-giving love, as you said, and that in turn can, in a sense, lift up even lousy liturgy in terms of outward metrics and so on. Hang on a second. I have to do something here. My apologies. My wife is sending me text messages, even though she knows that I'm involved in this YouTube video right now. So a big shout out to my beautiful wife, Carrie, who made me stop briefly and answer the text so that the dinging noises would stop. But anyway,
happy wife. Happy
life. That's right. That's right. That's right. So, but anyway, let's get back to your book and Ratzinger, and not that liturgy and a discussion of liturgy wasn't part of that, but I think related to this whole discussion of logos and ethos is the question of truth. Obviously, the question of truth. And one of Ratzinger's other motifs related to the logos motif is the priority of truth in theology, and how, because we talked before about the eclipse of God, and that one of the chief consequences, one of the chief victims of the eclipse of God is really the eclipse of truth in theology. So maybe you could comment on that.
Yeah, and the real thing, I mean, he, as you know, in his Regensburg lecture, right? His concern is, we've lost the sense of the primacy of truth, and then as a result, then if truth doesn't have primacy, well, then what does? Well, then ethos does, or will, and then hence you have this kind of irrational or ideologically driven violence that takes over, or simply truth becomes a matter of one's preference, right? I mean, the dictatorship of relativism, which he spoke about as, his homily as a cardinal prior to him being elected as pontiff. But a unique emphasis of Ratzinger is that truth, the logos, isn't just an idea; it's a person, right? Because he emphasizes quite a bit that we're not only called to know the logos can be loved, and the logos can be loved because this word is made flesh, right? It's someone with whom we can enter into a relationship with, and that, to my mind, is a game changer, right? So then it's not just a matter of these mental or intellectual exercises, because, as you know, I mean, you've worked in the academy, and for the academy, you can sometimes get caught in the ivory tower, and as a result, right? I mean, you forget that. Well, wait a minute. Truth is an actual living person. I mean, theology really does begin on the knees, and I really do have to have this, living relationship, or what kind of fruit is it actually going to bear, right? I mean, hence the quotation from Evagrius, right, one of the desert monks, right? I mean, the theologian is one who prays. And that's, I mean, there was a time where theologians and saints were one and the same, right, with the church fathers. I mean, other than Saint Bonaventure and Saint Thomas Aquinas, it seems rare, right, that you have intellectual saints. It becomes an exception rather than normative.
It shows too the great. Go ahead.
Yeah. So, Larry, I mean, I've always wondered, why do you think that is? Why do you think there? I mean, we had this great period where it was normative to be both an intellectual and a saint, But then, besides a kind of blip,
Well,
the Scholastic era, this could take us very far afield. But do you have thoughts on
oh yeah, I
that
do
part?
actually, because I was just about to say that your words right there remind me of how much cross fertilization there was between Ratzinger and Hans Urs von Balthasar. I mean, obviously they were close friends and collaborators throughout their lives, and of course Balthasar, his whole thing was the divorce between theology and sanctity in the modern theological guild. And he has a great essay, Balthasar does, called the Fathers, the Scholastics, and Ourselves. And he goes through the whole history of theology, and he goes, yeah, I mean, in the early patristic era, theology was essentially oriented to the monasteries. It came out of the monasteries, and therefore it was a theology, if not written by saints, at least people who were seriously making the effort at sanctity and living in an environment that was all about the production of sanctity, no matter how flawed the approach to it might be. And so there was this coming together of spirituality and theology, of sanctity and theology, and holiness in theology. Then this changes in the scholastic period. Not that the great scholastics themselves weren't, say, St. Thomas Aquinas, St. Bonaventure, St. Anselm. I mean, these were saintly men, but it must be remembered, all right, that they were, in a sense, formed by the more monastic culture. They were mendicants, but they were formed in this monastic mentality, and they wrote that way in many ways. In many ways, Aquinas, for example, was very mystical. Nevertheless, it was a school theology, and this is Balthasar's point. Okay, all of a sudden, theology is no longer oriented towards a monastic environment. It's oriented towards a school environment, a university environment. I mean, just look at the structure of the Summa as a series of questions and answers and objections, like a teacher standing up in a lecture hall saying, badum, 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 badum. And so that was great. I mean, as Balthasar says, that's great. It bought us a tremendous amount of precision that the fathers sort of lacked in their more symbolic, sacramental, poetic theology. The scholastics brought a kind of Aristotelian logic and precision and deductions and distinctions and definitions. And that was all needed and great. And that brought us some great clarity. But Balthasar goes, it was a two-edged sword, because at the same time, it altered the landscape of theology away from that monastic environment towards an academic environment. And then, of course, lesser lights that follow, in the scholastic tradition, the epigones, the lesser lights following the Bonaventures and the Aquinas, they're not nearly as monastic or holy as Aquinas. And so all of a sudden you get this school-based theology that becomes channelized, domesticated, and then sort of held up as a kind of orthodox way of thinking about it, that actually then in many ways gets weaponized in things like the Inquisition, or just forget the Inquisition, just in the machinations of the Holy Office and moving against various theologians. I'm not saying they didn't need to move against certain theologians. My point is an ethos, a mentality. All right. And that ethos was, from the dominant culture, one of a kind of authority rooted in a kind of power. And they then used this scholastic theology not to engender sanctity, but in a sense to create proper thinking and proper ideas. And that's all great, but something is lost in that process. Something is definitely
and so
lost.
really, I mean, that one of the things that, I mean, I'm thinking out loud here. Well, arguably I'm doing that the whole time, but we need a new monastic theology. It's been
Yes.
displaced by university theology, and you see it play out in pastoral practice. You have this separation between pastoral theology or pastoral practice, and then so-called academic theology. But this is foreign to our tradition. I mean, but it's created all kinds of different problems. But really, logos, these, ethos needs logos, right? I mean,
and this is not strange. Yeah. It's not strange from your book, because Ratzinger would agree with this completely. And I think it's part and parcel of his theological project, where logos precedes into ethos, or orthodoxy precedes into orthopraxis, as long as you get the priority of truth properly, and freedom properly oriented truth, and so on. Because we do need we do need a renewal in theology and in catechesis and in evangelizing.
And that's why, I mean, going back to the whole Christocentric point, right? I mean, it's not, I mean, Christ obviously is the center, but specifically, his sacrifice on the cross. I mean, because Ratzinger, in the chapter I have here in Christology, his sacrifice has to become our sacrifice. I mean,
yes,
he's a lot in many places. Ratzinger talks about the vicarious sacrifice of Christ, the stel vetritum, and that vicarious sacrifice should become the sacrifice of the church. He takes that one preposition, the whole notion of for, F-O-R, or pro existence, right? I mean, I'm called to live for others, right? This is my body given up for you, right? I mean, Christ's sacrifice has to become our way of life. And in that sense, Ratzinger, takes the notion of sacrifice and the spirit of liturgy and elsewhere and says, look, it's not about destruction, it's about theosis. It's about divinization. And what does that actually look like? It's translated into a life of love, right? I mean, so once again, you see Saint Maximus the Confessor and the rest of the tradition kind of coming to bear here.
This is so critical. I mean, Ratzinger and Balthasar are both part of this project of trying to bridge East and West, and Wojtyła as well, John Paul as well, and realizing the importance of theosis, divinization, in the entire landscape of sort of Christian thinking, East and West, that has to be retrieved.
I think it was in Bishop Barron's book. I can't think which one of his kind of autobiographical books, but he had a conversation with the American Benedictine Godfrey Diekman, who was a major contributor to the liturgical movement, and Father Diekman's comment was that one of the aspects of the liturgical movement that's been overshadowed is the notion of theosis, of divinization. It's not even on the radar. And really, Vatican II's contribution has been kind of this eschatological focus liturgy and eschatological focus church, which you see in Lumen Gentium and Sacrosanctum Concilium, which puts us more in contact with the East, right? I mean,
absolutely, that eschatological horror. I mean, in so many ways, after the council, we turned to liturgy. I mean, I lived through it, into a fellowship meal. The emphasis, as you said before, was all, you don't want to be cliche, but it's true. Some cliches are true. And, it reminds me of a great quote from the late, great David L. Schindler, to go back. He goes, all stereotypes are true. And what he meant by that was that there's a kernel of truth in every stereotype. Not racial stereotypes, but the sort of these sorts of general stereotypes about theology and whatever. All right. And so, yeah, it is absolutely true. There was this overly horizontalist emphasis and so the emphasis went away from theosis and sanctification, and it went towards, well, the liturgy is just supposed to make us all bond together better in solidarity and social solidarity with one. I mean, that's great. I think that is one of the functions of communal liturgy, is to create intentional community, social solidarity in Christ with one another. But when that's the only focus, that's the only ethos you've got, then you're in trouble. And that was
in terms of ecclesiology, you end up with this overemphasis on the people of God, and the people of God kind of as a sociological structure, right? It has nothing to do with people of God as originally kind of put out there in Lumen Gentium. Now it just becomes all about what the people want when they want.
Don't get me started on it. I mean, I wrote a whole thing in Catholic Old Report on the whole people of God motif. De Lubac, in his book on the church, has this 5 to 7 page section in there where he talks about the misuse of the people of God metaphor. It's very true. I mean, Lumen Gentium did privilege the people of God metaphor over the body of Christ metaphor. The mystical body of Christ metaphor, and that was deliberate. Lumen Gentium did not deny the mystical body of Christ metaphor, but it wanted to emphasize more, not so much the identity of the church with its head. It wanted to emphasize the distinction between the church and its head, in the sense that we are not the head. And as a pilgrim, talking about that eschatological horizon, as an eschatological people, we are not yet there. We are sojourning. We are still in via. We are on the way, and therefore we are. They use that people of God metaphor, but notice we are constituted according to Lumen Gentium precisely as the people of God by being incorporated into Christ the head. So, in other words, it didn't play mystical body off of people of God. It simply foregrounded people of God, presuming that you understood that the people of God metaphor is grounded in the previous mystical body metaphor. And so, hence, communio ecclesiology, the ecclesiology of communion, that essentially we're constituted as the people of God precisely by our inclusion in the Trinitarian communio of persons, now communicated to us through Christ in the Spirit in the Eucharist. And that's one of the central focuses of the Eucharistic celebration, is to create that people of God metaphor. But now we see this misuse of the people of God metaphor, as you said, as this purely horizontalist sociological understanding. We see it returning once again, and a lot of the nonsensical verbiage coming out of this synodal process right now. The synodality documents that I've seen are all sociologistic. Michael Hanby at the JP2 Institute has written beautifully on this. In an article, there's an issue of Communio on synodality, and Hanby just hammers away at this idea.
Yeah, and really, I mean, in accordance with the letter and spirit of Vatican II, right? Going back to Lumen Gentium, chapter 1 starts with the church as mystery, the church as sacrament, right? Christ is the Logos, right? I mean, and so in a certain sense, we can say it's not either or, people of God or body of Christ. It's both and, and once again, if we subordinate Logos to ethos, then you come up with this sociological construct. In fact, I was been preparing for lectures on Vatican II this coming weekend. So one of the things we do is prepare deacon candidates. We have a class, so it's a little study day on Vatican II. And looking at Lumen Gentium, one of the suggestions of the fathers was, and maybe it was Wojtyła, but to take the chapter on Mary, and that chapter should have preceded the chapter on the people of God, which would have been interesting, right? Theologically, that makes total sense. Mary is the true image, right, of the church. I mean, in connection with Balthasar, right, and the whole notion of the Marian image, right, over the Petrine.
It was a whole chapter in my dissertation, which eventually showed up in the summer '96 issue of Communio as an article.
It might have been a good corrective to the tendency that we see now, because the concern is, right, I mean, you have this subordination of Logos to ethos, and as far as the synod on synodality goes, you have this kind of this notion of the sensus fidelium that seems to be off the mark. But I'll leave that.
I mean, the whole debate at the council was more in the direction of, should we have a standalone document on Mary, or should our comments on Mary be included in Lumen Gentium? The issue of where in Lumen Gentium it should go, I think it went at the end simply because they just didn't want any more debate about, does she come before hierarchy, universal cult to holiness, people of God, church's sacrament, where does put her at the end? just let's do it at the end, because people need to understand, this, you've studied Vatican II. Those debates were contentious and intense. And I mean, let's give some props here to Paul VI, because he had one big mess on his hands. There were so many different factions at play, and the Theological Commission, once the original schemata were tossed out and said, okay, that's all too boilerplate neo-scholastic, we don't want that stuff. But the problem is that once you tossed all that stuff out, then all of a sudden it's okay, who's going to dominate now? Is it the ressourcement guys? Is it the more progressive liberal guys? Or are we going to let the traditionalists back in, the neo-scholastics back in? And then there were others as well. And then even within the ressourcement school, there were debates between the Polish and the French and the Germans and the English speakers, and likewise with the progressives. It's just in many ways amazing that the beautiful documents that emerged, like De Verbum Lumen Gentium from the council, are as profound as they are. And it is testimony to both to the Holy Spirit, but also to the actual acumen of the theologians and stuff at the council, who in many ways, often at the end of the day, set their differences aside and said, okay, this Monsignor Phillips, Gerard Phillips, is to be commended for one of the primary lights that sort of guided all this. Anyway, we're off topic now. I'm giving a little excursus on Vatican II,
On Vatican II.
but it's simply to point out that when to my viewers, if you do go back and read the council documents, read them carefully and be aware that for almost every paragraph there was a debate, and that there's very much a reason why this paragraph goes here, this paragraph goes here. So to bring it back to your original point, the fact that Lumen Gentium starts off with emphasizing the church as mystery, the church as sacrament, rather than starting off with the church as hierarchy, the church as perfect society. All right. It starts off with mystery and sacrament, which is kind of a ressourcement theme right there. And then it flows into the other stuff. And I think Ratzinger was very much on board with all of that.
Yeah, because it's the theme from the fathers that the church is analogous to the moon, right? That it is called to reflect merely the light of the sun, right? I mean, you have people like Hugo Rahner. I mean, he spoke Mary in the church that, at the time brought about this contribution, this renewal. Right?
I like Hugo better than Carl.
I do as well.
Wasn't he, if memory serves, Hugo Rahner wrote a great book on the theology of play. Well, I'd have to go back and look it up. It's neither here nor there.
But he did. Hugo did write that.
He wrote that.
Maybe Ignatius Press republished it. I don't remember.
I read it in my 20s, so that's like 40 years ago now, and I just remember it left an impression. So, anyways, if anybody out there Carl had a brother, Hugo, and he wrote some good stuff, and I liked, and despite all the garbage that people toss at Karl Rahner. People need to remember, I mean, I have huge theological disagreements with Rahner, big ones, don't get me wrong. But Rahner was a very, very profound thinker, and in many ways, I think, underappreciated these days in some quarters. But anyway, let's get back we're running sort of short on time here. I want to get back to some other themes in Ratzinger. And what I'd like to then focus on then would be politics, in the sense that what are the implications for the church's relationship with, in a sense, the political realm? And by politics, I mean it narrowly here, as in the state, governance, civil society, not the broader sense of politics of how we organize the polis in all of its various ramifications, which would involve the church. So, I mean, this is obviously a very complex question, but this relationship of logos to ethos, of the priority of truth, what consequences? I have some ideas in my own head from reading Ratzinger, but let's go to you. What consequences does this have for Joseph Ratzinger's political thinking?
Yeah, so I think the place, that I maybe as a point of departure is it comes from Eric Vogelin, who was at Louisiana State University.
Yes.
Philosophy department. The commonly quoted phrase, his concern is the immanization of the eschaton, right?
There you go.
And once we subordinate logos to ethos, right, then you have this kind of, you see this a lot in Marxism or in other forms of liberalism, this kind of building up the kingdom here and now. And so you have this over reliance upon the polis, or really political figures that arise. And in many ways, it is kind of it's the spirit of the Antichrist in the fullest sense, right? In absence of the authentic kingdom of God, you're going to focus on building up the kingdom of man here on earth. And you see it play out. In fact, it's contributed to the present polarization that we're experiencing. People have all their hopes placed upon the political savior, regardless of the party.
I just wrote about that, in the Register. The messianic quality.
Yeah, the messianic quality. And you see it in their, whether it's, making America great again, or it's about hope and change, it doesn't matter. The party, they use this messianic rhetoric because there's clearly this vacuum that's that's opened up. And then what happens is you have the church involved in areas of justice and the state involved in charity. I mean, that's not to say the church should not be concerned about injustices, obviously, and that the state should be concerned with charity. However, I mean, in terms of proper ordering, right? I mean, you don't want. I mean, you know, as Father Shaw, the late Father Shaw put it, the great Jesuit from Georgetown,
Yeah,
charity's not free. I mean, if charity's forced, it's not free, right? That's the concern with
that's right.
respect to the state,
Yeah,
right? And so you have he would be concerned about the current statism that we see, right? Where the state's becoming the be all end all, right? Whereas when you look at Caritas in Veritate, right, he emphasizes the need of charity, to be guided by the truth. Otherwise, you end up with sentimentality, or you end up with kind of a state-driven, charity, right? This is a major theme
yeah, yeah,
in
and
spaceology. You get this kind of false form of hope, a hope that is focused on the here and now, as opposed to that looks first to the kingdom and then takes that vision from the kingdom to reorient how we love people here.
yeah. I mean, there's a great quote from Introduction to Christianity that I use in a lot of my writings. I can't remember it verbatim because I'm an old fart and my brain is not what it used to be. But in essence, what he says in Introduction to Christianity is he says that the affirmation there is one God is precisely because it is not a political statement, a statement of the most profound political consequences. Because in a sense, it relativizes all political structures and universalizes the one God, creates in all of us a sense of the brotherhood and sisterhood of all people, but in that God, thus pointing towards the proper role of government as the fostering of that. And so, yeah, so that's an eschatological way of thinking of things, that there's a horizon way beyond the messianic horizon of our politics. And we need to constantly remember that. All that said, I don't know if I would characterize Ratzinger as a post-liberal thinker. You've got all these post-liberal kind of Catholic things, Patrick Deneen and Mike Hanby and others like this, post-liberal in their political thinking. You've got the guys up at New Polity, up your old neck of the woods, Steubenville, who are writing this post-liberal stuff. I would characterize my own politics as, in some sense, post-liberal. But Ratzinger also had many nice things to say about liberalism and political liberalism. And some of the advances that political liberalism did bring. Now, he would be quick to say those advances are rooted in Christianity, and those advances would have happened one way or the other even if political liberalism had never come around. Political liberalism, in other words, always likes to claim that it invented freedom of conscience and freedom of religion and civil liberties, and then the horrible, evil Christianity denied all those things, and we political liberals came along, kicked Christianity out of the throne, and now ensconced all these things. And Ratzinger has a point. No, the church was already moving in those directions, and all of those political liberties were already rooted in sort of especially Catholic forms of thought. All that being said, and for that reason, Ratzinger says, therefore, we can look at political liberalism and we can identify the Christian elements within it, such as freedom of religion, freedom of conscience, certain human rights and civil liberties, all the while, though, critiquing the logos that sort of now has supplanted the Christ logos in all of it. Now, does that make Ratzinger a post-liberal thinker? I think in some ways it does. In some ways it does. In some ways, I think he's just an liberal thinker. I think he just, he appreciates some of the latently Christian ideas, and liberalism is increasingly concerned with liberalism spinning away from those Christian foundations. But anyway, that's a lot of gobbledygook flowing out for me. Do you have any insights?
No, well, I mean, my word will be we can go real far afield, right? I mean, it seemingly once the church started appropriating rights language, for example, right? We already made this marriage with, to a certain degree, with the ideas from liberalism, and of course
Right.
with John Paul II, we and then Benedict, right? We baptized them, but still, right, to Deneen's point and others, right? The end of liberalism. We can kind of look back and maybe with people like Benestad and Ernest Fortin like raise the question: was this a good idea, right, to baptize these ideas? But that doesn't really take us far.
Yeah,
far
I think
afield.
Tracy Rowland raises that question too in
Yes.
one of her first
Tracy,
books, if not your first book. Whether or not, it was clearly a mixed bag to adopt the language of human rights because it carried with it certain
and it was
baggage.
really to some degree, it was in a lot of Father Schall's thought. He
Yeah,
in fact
but
he once made the comment to me that his most important work was actually on eschatology, and he thought the most important encyclical of Benedict was Spe Salvi, because it just brought to bear all
I
the
agree with that. I think Spe Salvi is great and one of the best encyclicals of the modern world. But I think too, one of the things that has to be kept in mind with regard to Pope John Paul, Karol Wojtyła, the Pole, uh, I think his adoption of human rights language had a certain geopolitical context to it as well.
Yeah.
I think John Paul was, he was a philosopher, and so he was well aware of the two-edged sword that human rights language had. He was well aware that it could be taken in this neutralist, non-Christian sense, that you could have these things absent Christ. In some sort of false neutralist, but still, I think he adopted the human rights language as a tool against the Soviet Union. All right, and he lived through Nazism. He saw those horrors, and then his country was still under Soviet domination, and I think he saw the language of human rights as a kind of useful sort of language, a useful Esperanto for talking to the world in a way that non-Catholics even could at least inchoately, in some vague sense, understand, and to use that language then to oppose the various leviathans, political leviathans that were out there. But anyway, go ahead. You were going to say something.
Because there was a time when people like Jacques Maritain and other Catholic thinkers, right? I mean,
oh yeah,
declaration, on human rights could use such language. But the question is, could they use that language now? It seems like you'd be hard pressed, because once again we're working under a different logos.
We are, and in Maritain,
or just simply the abandonment of logos.
And in Maritain's case, it is never to be forgotten that he's French, and the French. I mean, whether you're talking Maritain or de Lubac or Garrigou-Lagrange, you had the French Dominicans and the French Jesuits, and you had this entire history of l'Action or l'Action Française. You had the Vichy government. You had the Republic, and so you had even thinkers like Monnier, who were very, and Lagrange, who were very smitten with the Vichy government, and Marshal Pétain, and they were just so anti-republican in their ethos, in their thinking, and sort of wanted a kind of return of a kind of French Christendom, that they were willing to put up with a lot of things, and I think Maritain, to a certain extent. He obviously was appalled at the anti-Semitism and so forth. But what we need to understand is a lot of these French guys like Maritain, they were under the boot of a very oppressive, secularizing, and aggressive French regime that caused them, I think, to long for the resurrection of a certain Catholic France. And the language of human rights that Maritain then works out in his natural law theorizing was a very, very profound and useful tool in that project. And Maritain truly hoped that after the war, that liberalism and so forth would be so discredited that there would now be space for a coming together of Catholicism and in a sense modern political thinking to create this new sort of French Catholic Christendom. He later obviously became very bitter about that project. But anyway, once again, I'm off on a tangent. But I think it's always important to contextualize these guys, and the French have a history. This is my point, that has to be simply understood. All of these debates have histories that have to be understood.
Yeah, and it was the guy named Spaz. I mean, that scammer was particularly contentious. Divided among the French and German line. The French were
Oh,
on one
yeah.
side of the spectrum, and the Germans, were another. So
Very much so. And then, of course, in Dignitatis Humanae and the discussion of religious freedom, it introduced into the mix then the Americans and their. Remember, John F. Kennedy had been, elected, then assassinated, the first Catholic president. You had John Courtney Murray trying to make the case that America was a crypto-Catholic country in its constitutional arrangement, and that the Vatican Council should simply bless the American concept of separation of church and state and our constitutional order. The council rejected that. Of course, Murray spun it in that direction when he got home. And of course, David Schindler spent most of his career fighting that notion. But then at the council, then you brought up the Germans, the French, but then also the Polish bishops in that whole debate about religious freedom. You had a lot of German bishops that were simply pushing, that were sort of kind of like the Americans, saying, oh, let's just adopt sort of the modern world's concept of separation here and let's get on with it. Whereas the French and the Poles came together, and Wojtyła was critical here, came together. And then once again, David Schindler and Nick Healy have a great thick book on Dignitatis Humanae that points this out. Mm-hmm. They said what ends up at Dignitas, they listen to the French and the Poles. And eventually what they say is, yes, religious freedom, yes. You can still have a confessional state if for whatever reason you want a confessional state and that works out. But whatever confessional state you have, it has to have religious freedom. It has to have religious freedom because freedom is grounded in human dignity. It's grounded in our being made in the image and likeness of God. And this, to bring it back to Ratzinger, Ratzinger writes on this score in his commentary on this, and that's because truth is constitutively oriented to freedom, and freedom is constitutively oriented to truth. And therefore, a coerced faith is no faith. And therefore, we must be free in our conscience, in our freedom to, not in a neutralist sense, but in our freedom to pursue the good and the truth of God freely in a non-coercive way. Now, that's controversial in its own right, but that's that. So the point is, we're talking about context and history and the debates that were going on. And the French and the Poles, actually, it was the Wojtyłan wing of things that won the day, and not the John Courtney Murray wing. But anyway, you're speechless. That left you speechless, I guess. But as I go off on my own little tangents here, talking about Vatican,
and I'm also watching our clock here.
Oh yeah, well we're kind of Zoom is gonna time me out here in about 1 minute or so. So I just any last words for? We've had a very. That's why I don't script these things. I love it when the conversation just takes off, because then I can always get back on my own hobby horses and drag everything back to what it is that I'm interested in, rather than my guests.
I think to wrap it up, I the image that I like is Ratzinger's drawing from St. Basil the Great. He's talking about the prophet Amos's idea of the sycamore tree, and the sycamore tree is a symbol for pagan culture. And the idea is that the fruit of the sycamore tree has to be slit, otherwise the fruit becomes rotten and useless. And so Ratzinger comments, we have to basically slit the world with the logos, and that's what makes the world tasteful and tasty and useful. And then to end here on Ratzinger's own words, he says the logos itself must slit our culture in their fruit, so that what is unusable is purified and becomes not only usable but good. And ultimately, only the logos himself can guide our cultures to their purity and maturity. But the logos makes us his servants, the dresser of sycamore trees. And so we need that relationship between liturgy and eschatology, primacy of logos, to bring it all back.
And that is a great way to end, as well as once again promoting your book here, A Living Sacrifice, Liturgy and Eschatology, and Joseph Ratzinger, Dr. Roland Millare. Great book, fantastic book. I'm sorry that all of my tangents didn't get us to talk more about it, but I think we got to the essence of what's so darn important about it.
We got the essence of it. Well,
we can always do this again. We can always have. I love you're great. I love having guests on that can talk some stuff and get into it. So that's great. Sure. Thank you so much for coming on, and I hope everybody enjoyed this conversation. So I'm going to hit the recording button now. And so long, everybody.